So, a quick discussion of this discussion, week 5, the Atlantic revolutions. The question right here: what role do race, ethnicity, and gender play in the revolutions in the Atlantic world, Europe, Africa, South Central Asia, and North America between 1750 and 1900? How are these revolutions related to settler colonialism? Why were there no comparable revolutions in the rest of the world? Is liberalism, which you need to define, a purely Western concept? Why or why not? Citation mandatory, multimedia inclusion mandatory, reference to the textbook, whichever one of these four you were using, and the chapters that you should have read for this, as well as Frankopan and Harari, both of whom talk about this, right? For a discussion of settler colonialism, you had these two resources to look at to help define what it is, because in the course of doing this, you needed to define what it was. So, three big areas: race, ethnicity, and gender, which come into play here. This is where we get to what is referred to as a discussion of intersectionality, how race, ethnicity, and gender create different hierarchies within a society. We're also, though, talking about the Atlantic revolutions, and virtually none of you actually discussed any of them. If you did, it was principally the one that occurred when the British colonies in North America revolted against Britain, which is interesting because that one particularly is the least of the ones that involve race, ethnicity, and gender. The biggest reason being that it is an exception to all of those other revolutions, principally because it's what most historians refer to as a middle-class revolution. Very few of you actually, again, used revolutions as examples or supported your ideas by using the revolutions specifically. If you had, it would have made a big difference in how the grades on this discussion are going to play out. The North American Revolution, or the colonial revolution against Britain that occurred in North America, happened principally because Britain was trying to crack down and limit the profit margin that most of those guys were making off of illegally trading. To put it in context, in the 1660s, the British had passed a lot of navigation acts, which were meant literally to limit who the colonists could trade with, principally because of this idea of mercantilism, this idea that all the money needed to stay within a specific empire, and the only way to do that was to make sure that the people in the empire were not trading with other empires. And this is, again, that period of massive colonization and imperialism, right? And they, for some reason, and it's kind of interesting as to why they would believe this, given that the Spanish had just laid claim to much of the Western Hemisphere, and in the doing were importing massive amounts of silver and some gold, right? So they were bringing more and more wealth into the Spanish Empire, but there was a belief that there was a finite amount of wealth in the world, and the way that you won, literally, the game of empires was by keeping as much money in your own empire without giving it away to others. And the idea behind this, when it comes to trade, was to effectively try to sell more to other empires than people were buying. But this also meant controlling what people were selling to other empires. In the 1660s and those navigation acts, effectively what the British government was trying to do was tell the colonists that they could only sell directly to Britain, and that the British government would control what goods from Britain got sold to the French, to the Spanish, to the Portuguese, etc. But over in the Western Hemisphere, where there were other colonies, it was much easier and much more expedient for the colonists to sell directly to other colonies and to each other. The British didn't even want that. They didn't even want the colony of the Carolinas selling directly to New York. They wanted everything to go back to London, and from London be redistributed back to the colonies. And this was, again, to control what was going where and the taxes on it. But at that point in time, in the 1660s, up until effectively the 1760s, the British government wasn't paying a lot of attention to what was going on with the European colonies, principally because they were far more interested in what they were doing in India and in other parts of the world. So this thing called salutary neglect came into play. While these laws were on the books, the British weren't strongly enforcing them in the colonies. So for about 5 generations, the colonists got used to being able to do things on their own. And while they recognized it was illegal, they basically considered that since the British weren't imposing those laws on them, that they didn't really mean anything. And this becomes their defense when, after the war between, well, we call it in U.S. history, we call it the uh, French and Indian War. The British referred to it differently. It was the war between Britain and France over the colonies, but it effectively started because of the colonists themselves. And I won't go into all the details for you. Your textbook has a lot of them, and they're very good. But effectively, that war between Britain and France expanded into what is considered to be one of the first world wars because it was fought everywhere that Britain and France had colonies. And it ended up costing the British a tremendous amount of money. And once the war was over and the British had won, they foundationally um, considered that the colonists weren't paying their fair share for causing the war or for the idea of having to maintain the colonies and protect them by keeping British troops there. Inversely, the colonists in the Western Hemisphere didn't want British troops there. In fact, they wanted less British presence and less British taxation. And this is why when we think of that war, we think of it as a war about taxation. In reality, that's simplistic. There was a whole lot more going on to it. But most of it literally had to do with the idea that the colonists wanted to keep more of their money themselves and make more decisions about who they were going to trade with, not fewer. And this is what leads to effectively the revolt against Britain. It takes a couple of years, and we talk about if you're doing U.S. history, that's where we could get the discussion of the significance of common sense, Thomas Paine's piece, where he was basically trying to convince those people who were not wealthy in the colonies, of which there were many, that this war was a good thing, that being independent Britain was a good thing. All right, so the next big revolution to come along was the French Revolution, and it in turn kind of comes the same way as the U.S. Revolution does, in that it starts literally with France being bankrupt, and the people who have been making some money, this evolving middle class, feeling shut out of the decision-making process in France. And that's part of also why it becomes so chaotic, because these people who ultimately end up being in control don't have any idea about how to do it. And they're so angry at the elite, the people they consider to have been controlling things for so long, that you go through that period of Robespierre's control with the executions of hundreds of thousands of people just for the accusation that they were related to royalty or that they were aristocrats, that they didn't understand how to work. This is all part of what is referred to as the Reign of Terror. At the end of the Reign of Terror, again, because nobody has any idea of actually how to run a government, things become corrupt and despotic, leading to the rise of Napoleon, who basically comes in, appeals to the majority of the people because he seems to be able to make some decisions and to do things, and leading him to effectively take over as a dictator. In practical terms, the French Revolution fails because in the outcome of it, you don't get a new republic. People don't get their rights. They get the imposition of a dictatorship, which leads to another world war, the Napoleonic Wars, between almost all of Europe and France, that ultimately end in 1815 with the reinstitution of monarchy in France. And that monarchy is being supported by the other powers in Europe. But the French Revolution does lead to the Third War, which was the Haitian Revolution. And many of you do see that one, and it's pretty clear because that's definitely one based on race. The Haitians, and it again is another one where the middle class is involved, but that middle class is a mixed blood middle class. And that middle class is principally interested in being recognized as French people because at the point in time that it starts, Haiti is one of the French colonies. And interestingly, even though the French Revolution had started, they had issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, declaring that everybody was equal. When a committee of Haitian people went to France to meet with Parliament to say basically, okay, we recognize that French citizens, we too should be free. We also think we should do away with slavery. Well, at that point in time, and again, bearing in mind that the French Revolution started because of the bankruptcy of the government of France, um, the people in Parliament basically said, yeah, no, you can't, because we need the money coming out of that colony, which is the only one that really was making a huge amount of money. It was a sugar colony, in order to stay financially solvent. Now, again, this is prior to the rise of Napoleon, but it leads directly to the Haitian Revolution, because when this group of freed, basically middle class merchant people of mixed blood returned, they're so angry that they ally themselves with the slaves in a revolt against their French overlords and owners, and that's how the Haitian Revolution gets started. Toussaint Louverture is, of course, the big hero out of that. Um, he himself had been a slave owner, but had decided as this went on that slavery was indeed wrong, and got all the slaves behind them. And that, of course, was the most successful slave revolt in the history of the Western Hemisphere. Um, it does lead to the creation of a democracy in Haiti, but one that is fraught with problems for pretty much, well, even into the present. Um, Because, though, it is now a free state, most of the colonies and the countries that are developing in the Western Hemisphere run by white men won't trade with the Haitians, which is a big part of why poverty in Haiti goes all the way back to the revolution itself, to attaining that. All right. Other revolutions that you could have mentioned, especially on the issue of ethnicity, are, of course, the Latin American revolutions, all of which basically start um, by mixed blood people who want their independence once they see what's going on in um, North America and in Haiti. They too want to have equality and to have a say in what's going on in their government. So, in many respects, the revolutions through um, the Atlantic world, the Atlantic revolutions, are founded on this premise, but a lot of them are also founded on pushing back against what they consider to be controlled by white people, or particularly white Europeans. Again, examples of all of those needed to go in to support whatever your answer is. When it comes to gender, there's also the issue, and you can look at this in all of these, of what role women should play. In the US Revolution, of course, the best example, John Adams' wife, um, Abigail, writes a letter to him basically saying, don't forget the ladies, remember that we too play a role here. And while the founders who create uh, the government after the revolution, the two governments after the revolution, don't recognize that, there is a movement towards what is called Republican motherhood, and the understanding that women take care of the children through their formative years, so it is necessary for women to be educated and to have an understanding of the world around them. The belief was, and this harkens back in many respects to ancient Rome and Greece, that the head of the household voted for the entire household, and that a woman's power came from being the wife of a man and having influence over him directly to help influence his vote. So she didn't need a vote directly. That argument's going to be perpetual throughout the Western world up until effectively the late 1800s, early 1900s, when women finally get the right to vote in most democratic countries in the West. In the French Revolution, Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, women were included, and many of you went to Olympia de Gouges, who made a very strong, forceful argument about why women should be equal politically to men. Um, in Haiti, it was a similar thing. It was women also were at the head point of much of the fighting through there, and certainly they were in these, excuse me, in the Latin American revolutions. So all of those significant points. You had excellent examples of all of those in each of all of the Atlantic revolutions. How were these revolutions related to settler colonialism? Now that's kind of a hard question to come to, because settler colonialism, and I appreciate those of you who actually worked with it, settler colonialism is the idea that people can move in and take the land away from the indigenous people. It's often the idea that leads to genocide. And in fact, the most successful settler colonists were the British, because they do that in the Western Hemisphere, particularly in North America. They do it in Australia. They do it anywhere where they found indigenous people they didn't want to deal with. They just moved them off the land and, if necessary, also committed genocide in order to get rid of them so they could get the land. Where we see settler colonialism mostly at play is in the Latin American revolutions, where one of the big arguments made by many of the people fighting was that the natives and the mestizo people wanted their land back. And this would become problematic because it is the large landed European, Spanish, particularly gentry, who have control of that and who are fighting against these revolutions and the ideas of reallocating the land. Why are there no comparable revolutions in the rest of the world? Um, and this leads directly into, is liberalism, in this case, defined as classical liberalism, the idea of expanding the right of government participation to men who principally own property, because the ownership of property gives them a vested interest in what the government does. And that is what classical liberalism is. It's the idea of taking the rule away from one man or one monarchy, and including all men who actually have who are directly impacted by government, particularly government taxation. Why are there no comparable in the rest of the world? Is it purely a Western concept? Um, that's a yes and no question. It is a principally Western concept in this period because it's a byproduct of the Enlightenment. But the Enlightenment is very much driven by trade and by ideas about the changing economy. The changing nature of trade is the basis of an economy. And within that, the idea that if you can make new money and new wealth, then you should have a voice in government. It shouldn't just be the people who have always controlled land. And that's a big part of where it is a Western concept in this time, because it's the Western Europeans who are spreading out, colonizing everywhere, even taking over older societies like China and India and the like. Um, you can argue that those ideas exist there, and a few of you did go to some examples of revolutions in China, attempted revolutions in China at this period. But many of those were not driven by this idea of every man being able to participate in government. This is more of an idea, or even wealthy men being able to participate in government. You could argue that the Chinese didn't need it because they had the bureaucratic structure already in place, and people had the opportunity, well, men had the opportunity to become part of the civil administration by taking the tests. There are a lot of different ways to look at that. And I think Harari and Frankopan both give you some really good examples through here on both causes. Harari loves the Enlightenment period. It's the basis of science and these ideas, these revolutions, which will lead to major changes in the way we perceive things. He talks about that more in the section on industrialization, which will also be influential this coming week 6. Frankopan's talking directly about the causes of these revolutions and how the recognition of peoples who are not white is becoming more and more significant throughout all of the world, not just in the Western Hemisphere or the Atlantic revolutions, but also going into the Middle East, into China, and into Asia. So there was a lot there you could use from him as well. All right, so I'm going to tie this up because you're going to need to be working with this for the midterm. I am going to say here in this video now, and I'm going to put it in the note that I put in with this video, that if you wish to have some sort of meeting with me, I can arrange a time to actually, meet with a number of you at the same time. That would be my preferred way to do it, preferably sometime tomorrow, Thursday, or early Friday, so that we can talk about the exam, the midterm. If you want to talk about it, talk about what's going to be required of it and what you're going to need to know. So I will post that again in the post where I put this as the wrap up for this week. Again, many of you aren't including the required Harari, Frankopan readings. Many of you are not using the required multimedia, and many of you are not using the textbook. Again, many examples could have been used to support your ideas here and needed to be used to support your ideas because there were a lot of revolutions talked about this week in the textbook readings. So you're going to need to know all that for the exam. Let me know if you have questions.